as we had discussed and begin a brief introduction with what natural resource management is. So in this lecture, we're going to look into what the kind of debates and challenges which have been encountered through the works of some scholars who have been working closely in this line, the debates about the common property versus the private property vis-a-vis the natural resources, and more importantly which focuses on how people are being dependent on resources, and what are the kind of existing debates which have evolved over a period of time, and then how some strands of theories are also being developed as a pursuit to understanding about these existing debates. So first and foremost, we begin with the works of Gerrit Herdint, the seminal works entitled as The Tragedy of Commons, which was published way back in 1968 in the journal paper called Science. So the Tragedy of the Commons, as I had pointed out, is published by the American ecologist Gerrit Herdint, and what it tries to look into this particular work of his is that Herdint was trying to sort of warn the dangers of human overpopulation, and he is also known for his expositions of Tragedy of Commons, as I had pointed out, which sort of like called attention to the damage that innocent actions by individuals can inflict on the environment. So there is a rising urgency about how the economic problem in some way brought about by the overuse of common resources such as water, land and pastures. So in which almost every individuals, assuming that being a rational being, tries to reap the or tries to appropriate nature by getting the greatest benefit from a given resource. So humans have that tendency of maximizing the from something that is profit. So in a situations when two or more activities that produce results depend for the success on some limited resources. Now what the Tragedy of the Commons attempts to look at or explains is that why growth stop or declines after a period of time because of limited resources shared among group or individuals. So one can perhaps think about the environmental issues which are being caused by overfishing, overgrazing, or maybe depletions of forest resources, mostly where communal ownership or the common pooled resources are being available. Now this phenomenon of Tragedy of the Commons, which I could call the phenomenon Tragedy of the Commons, occurs because the actors or people who are stakeholders who are concerned do not pay attention to the effects of their actions. So therefore they continue to engage in a kind of undesirable behavior until it's too late to undo or fix the resource. Sometimes the actors may be perhaps aware of the situations, but take less concern to slow down if they recognize that others will reap all the benefits. Now for us to have a better idea of what actually the Tragedy of Commons is, let's have a kind of a picture skew in our mind so that we have a better idea or understanding about this. Now, citing an example of shared common grazing pasture. So, assuming that there's some land that people use as pasture for their animals, or we could say that grazing lands. So nobody knows, nobody owns, so it is actually being open to anyone to come and graze their livestock on the land. And in this scenario, everyone has the rights to pastures to graze as many animals as possible. So acting in the self-interest for the greatest short-term personal gain. So eventually they use up all the grass in the pasture, the shared resources in the end depleted and no longer useful, or it has actually become barren. So one can actually see that since the pasture is open to all, it is to be expected that the herdsman will try to keep as many cattle as possible on the commons. So the inherent logic of the commons remorselessly generates a tragedy, because as a rational being, each herdsman seeks to maximize his gain, and ultimately at the cost of the commons. So in some sense, several other kinds of similar real life scenarios or situations are also happening around us. For instance, overfishing, pollutions, deforestation, etc., and overgrazing on common grazing pastures are something which we have sort of like tried to experience in our everyday life. Now, the tragedy of the commons which we have discussed so far describe a situation in the economic science when the individual user who have open access to the resource unhampered by social shared social structures or formal laws that govern access and use, act independently according to their own self-interest and contrary to the common good of all users, and thereby cause depletions of resource through their uncoordinated action. So although this open access resource system may collapse due to overuse, such as in overfishing or maybe overgrazing, as I have cited earlier. So many examples have existed and still do exist where members of a community with regulated access to a common resource cooperate to exploit those resources prudently without collapse or even creating a perfect order, or in short we can say that how they have been sustainably using the resources of the commons or the common resource. Now in a modern economic context, commons, that particular word commons is taken to mean any open access and unregulated resource such as the atmosphere, oceans, rivers, or even office refrigerator in some sense. So in a legal context, it is a type of property that is neither private nor public, but rather held jointly by the members of a community who govern access and use through social structures, traditions, or formal rules. So the term is also used in environmental science, and the tragedy of the commons is often cited in the connection with sustainable development and massing economic growth and environmental protection, as well as in the debate over global warming, for instance. Now in this particular essay, the tragedy of the commons, what Garrett Hardin argue is that the main difficulty in solving environmental problems is the conflict between the short-term interest of the individual and the long-term welfare of society. So the example he used was the commons or the areas of land that belong to the whole village or whole community. Now, it was in the interest of the individual, for instance, to put as many animals in the commons as possible. However, if too many animals graze on the commons, they destroy the grass. So once the grass was destroyed, everyone suffered because no one could raise animals on the commons. So the commons were eventually replaced by closed fields owned by individuals, and owners were now assumed to be more careful not to put too many animals on their land, because overgrazing wouldn't allow them to raise as many animals in the upcoming years. So Hardin's points being that someone or some group must take the responsibility for maintaining a resource, or it will become depleted, or sense of ownership or sense of responsibility is something which we can, which can sort of like avoid such kind of tragedy. So Hardin's point in some sense can be applied to our modern commons, natural resources, and humans' life in societies, and in the societies we can solve environmental problems by planning, organizing, considering the scientific evidence, proposing a solution. So one can actually see the cause and benefits, that is the cost of environmental solutions can in some way be very high. So the result depends on who is actually doing the analysis. So one can also perhaps take the case of the developing countries, because in the developing countries there is unequal distribution of wealth and resources around the world, and which of course influence the environmental problems and solutions society can actually make. Whereas the developed countries have higher incomes and slower population growth, and also diverse industrial economies, and stronger social support. So one can actually look at the way in which how these notions or ideas of how the tragedy of commons have to be looked and posited. So but then this particular idea which is being posited by Garrett Hardin in some sense goes without criticism. So some of the criticisms which we can sort of think about is that the tragedy of the commons always or frequently is being cited in favor of privatization of the public property. So the problems which is being identified by Hardin actually apply to expansive resources that are unregulated, or where regulation is difficult to enforce. Again, Hardin's actual topic was population controlled. He sort of interpreted that excessive reproductions as a free rider problem. So this argument is hardly ever taken seriously or even discussed. So there are also people who says that it is historically inaccurate. So because it is difficult to find a passage of comparable length and fame that contains so many errors as the one quoted. And then the tragedy of the commons is one of modern world's most dangerous myth, which is opined by George Monbiot. And on the other hand, overuse of the commons in traditional societies was generally prevented through a sophisticated structure of norms or arrangements practiced by the respective communities, and there is no evidence of systematic overgrazing. And the tragedy of commons, again, the tragedy which is, what Hardin describes, is in fact not a tragedy in the literal sense of the term or tragedy of common property, but rather a tragedy of open access regimes. So one can actually look at the way in which how later in his later work Hardin came up with a different work which is referred as the tragedy of unmanaged or unregulated commons. So in some sense he is sort of like trying to change his positions, or the way in which he tries to look into the resources vis-a-vis private and common property. Now if you look at the works of some of further on governing the commons, that is, although there is open access resource system may sort of collapse due to overuse, such as what we have seen as in the overfishing or overgrazing. Now again, as a rebuttal to what Garrett Hardin has come up with his theory, we will sort of try to discuss this in the light of what Elinor Ostrom has actually discusses in her book Governing the Commons, which was published way back in 1990. Now what Elinor Ostrom tries to discuss in her books actually tries to include examples of how the local communities were able to do this without top-down regulations or privatizations, and in fact it also tries to see in the way in which how members of a community were able to regulate access to a common resource through cooperation and cooperate to exploit the resource prudently without collapse or even creating a perfect order. So one can actually see the way in which how the relative advantage of the private property and common property for the efficiency, equity and sustainability of natural resource used patterns have been actually debated in legal and economic literatures for several decades and centuries now. So the debate has been actually clouded by troika of confusion that relate to the difference between common property and open access regime, common pool resources and common property regimes, and thirdly a resource system and the flow of resource units. So in some way a property is an enforceable authority to undertake particular actions in specific domains. So therefore the rights to access, withdrawal, management, exclusion and alienations can be separately assigned to different individuals as well as being viewed as cumulative scale that is moving from the minimal right of access through possessing full ownership rights. Now what Elinor Ostrom tries to posits in her book or in her work is that it attempts to look at the problems of collectively managing shared resources because of the book's assuming nature and rather a formally scholarly tone. So it's easy to pass it over as just an academic work. Now Ostrom actually uses the particular term called common pool resources to denote that natural resources used by many individuals in commons such as fisheries, groundwater basins and irrigation systems. So such resources have long been subject to over exploitation and misuse by individuals acting in their own best interest, in their own best interest. So conventional solutions typically involve either a centralized governmental regulations or privatizations of the resource. But according to Ostrom, there is an alternative or a thought approach to resolving the problem of the commons, that is the design of durable cooperative institutions that are organized and governed by the resource users themselves. So one of the central premises or the central questions in this study which she argues is how a group of principles who are interdependent situations can organize and govern themselves to obtain continuing joint benefits when all face temptations to or otherwise act opportunistically. So the heart of this particular study is an in-depth analysis of several long-standing and viable common property regimes, and this book is again chiefly aimed at policymakers, bureaucrats, and resource users rather than some of the scholars. Now further, if you look at the debate over private versus common property, what exactly is private property? Private property is considered to be by most economists to be an essential ingredient in economic development due to incentives associated with diverse kinds of property relations. Now common property regimes again are, on the other hand, are premised by many economists to be inefficient, and they have given three reasons or source for this inefficiency. The first one is rent dissipation, because since nobody owns the products of a resource until they are being captured, and everyone are assumed to engage in unproductive race to capture these products before others do. Secondly, there is high transaction and enforcement costs, which is expected if the communal owners were to try to devise rules, that is to reduce the externalities of their mutual overuse. And thirdly, low productivity, because no one has an incentive to work in order to increase his or her private returns. So these are some of the points which are being outlined from the economic perspective or by the economists for the inefficiency. However, common property resources are argued by many scholars who are working on the research areas of commons, argue that the common property resource are seen to be equitably and sustainably managed resource by the community of users as opposed to the free riding common resources. And deforestation, of course, often results from social injustice and political inequalities, and forests have a great economic value and are a sustained source of income to many communities who are living closely with those resources. So they can be seen as a contested resource over which many different sectors or of the society seeks to assert to control. Now some of the environmental problems which we usually encounter, like degradations of forests and property rights problems, and most conflict in forests actually arises because of the difficulties in clarifying the property regime. So then one of the main pertinent questions which arises is that to what form of property rights should be adopted, that is either private property rights, state property rights, or common property rights. So the situations of no property right is ruled out as this leads to Hardin's Perlin's tragedy of commons. Again, in the common property, the members of a clearly demarcated group have a legal right, that is to exclude non-members of that group or that geographical area from access and use to resources. So therefore, in the absence of such right, if the resource generates highly valued products, there will be no incentive system to conserve their use for anyone, and misuse and overconsumption will in some sense allow to leading to the situations called open access regime, known as res nullius. Now Ostrom over here argued that the common property regimes controlling access and harvesting from forests had evolved over long periods of time in all parts of the world, but were rarely given a formal status in the legal codes of the developing countries. Now for instance, many of the forest dwellers are hardly being their rights of using and access to resources are hardly being recognized, even when there are certain formal laws which are being framed. For instance, the Indian Forest Dwellers Act, which sort of like tries to accommodate and give rights to those people who are in and around that resources. So in some sense, the common property is a way of or a strategy of privatizing rights to use a resource without having to divide the resource into individual holdings. And apparently there has been the failure in recognizing common property as a regulated form of resource tenure and use, and then which of course is managed by group of users with exclusive rights to do so. Now let's quickly look at the way in which how forest resource and sustainability can in some sense be looked from the standpoint of a common property theory and its contribution based on the works of Arun Agrawal. Now, as we all know, forests have been and continue to be central to the human survival, livelihoods, and prosperity. And the study of forests as commons has been one of the central sources of stimulus to the development of scholarship on common property. So therefore, one can actually see the different ways in which forests have been and continue to be central to human survival, and the relationship between, for instance, the indigenous peoples and forests are something which we have to in-depthly examined and looked into. And one can also see the the positions of the communal and indigenous actors in the developing world is far stronger, and private actors on the other hand possess only 5.6% in contrast to 14.1% of forests which is characterized by the communal tenure. However, since half of the billion people or more may be dependent on forest for their livelihoods, the total area of communities owned and controlled seems quite low. So much of the increase in community controlled over forests should be actually viewed as a part of a process of decentralization by national governments. So in the case of the Indian subcontinent, we could see the joint forest management where the locals are being considered to be part of these policies of conservations. So therefore, the involvement of local actors and pressures from communities and indigenous groups for greater control over their lands, and then some evidence shows that local actors have the capacity to protect and use forest resources sustainably at a lower cost than many of the government agencies. So these are something which is based on some of the evidences and case studies. Now the question is how rights in relation to forest are broadly distributed in the different parts of the world, and one can also see that from the works of what we have discussed a while ago by Elinor Ostroms. Now in some of the study of Ostrom, the characteristics of the resource system, which includes biophysical variables as one of the set of structuring conditions, are in her institutional analysis and development framework. So biophysical variables such as soils, topography, fire and pest. So one biological aspects of forest that has received substantial attention by common scholar is that their ability to yield multiple products, which can often be harvested to yield significant economic benefits for users without having highly adverse effects on the forest itself. Now how do we then try to relate the forest as a common property? So most of the forest in the post colonial period are actually owned by the states or governments, but private and other forms of ownership are however increasing, and governments often set aside areas for use by communities, not really giving them the usufruct rights. So the importance of forests in relation to two of the most important global environmental threats, that is climate change and biodiversity loss, is hardly to overstate, and they have long been considered or recognized to be the reservoir and source of much of the species of biodiversity on the planet. So therefore forests no doubt played an important role or a significant role in the livelihoods of the rural poor, that is in the context of competing claims from multiple parties. So therefore we could see how the forest and common properties are being located and discussed. It can also fairly be argued that most resources are actually managed by groups which are being divided along multiple axes, that is among them ethnicity, gender, religion, wealth and caste. And then we could also see the different dimensions of social versus political versus economic heterogeneity, and have potentially differing impacts on resource governance. So forests, as we have already discussed at length, that has been an important source of livelihoods to the poor rural communities, and community based governance in forests, that is the common property arrangements, are far more perceived to be far more common in the developing rather than the developed world. That is how the forest based commons are to be contextualized and situated. So scholars of these forest based commons address the increasing concerns about equity and livelihood, as well as sustainable forest management, and quite a number of scholars actually questioned the extent to which these non-wood forest products can be or constitutes an important in terms of alleviating poverty, or how these forest resources can actually uplift the economic conditions of these people who are living closely with the natural resources. And also this way of trying to measure and understand is again typically a form of a safety net that is relevant mostly for the people who are the people concerned, that is who are poor, the poor rural communities. So therefore one can actually see that how forest based resources are to be seen in relation with the way in which how it can actually solve some of these problems such as poverty. And also there are also scholars who are interested in trying to look at the issues of gender equity, have tried to contextualize and discuss how these non-wood forest products or non-timber forest products are critical for the livelihood in much of the developing world, because many of the rural women folks are actually dependent on the nearby resources which sort of like provides fuel, fodder, and then also different edible items, plants, and then which is solely for their consumptions and also partly for their income to sell those products in the markets. Therefore there has been a significant research which has been done on these forest based commons, and through many of these works there has been suggestions that the economically and politically better off group members are often likely to gain a larger share of benefits from a resource. So you could actually see the inequitable distributions of wealth and resources, where even in the case of the forest based commons or common open access regime, there are few sections of individuals such as the economically and better off group members who actually takes the lion's share or the largest share of benefits from the resource. So at this point one can critically looked at that, is the common natural resource, common community based natural resource management the way out or solution. We have discussed so far the ideas which is posited by Garrett Hardin on the one hand, which talks about the ills of the common property regimes, or which highlighted about the tragedy of the common property or tragedy of the commons, and also ideas which is again being posited forward by the Elinor Ostrom, which sort of like talks or argue in antithetical to what is being posited by Garrett Hardin, and which talks about governing of the commons, where the commons are actually sustainably using the resources. So at this point one can also see that from the works, that is the kind of significant research which has been done on the forest based commons, in some way suggests that the economically and politically better off group actually gained the largest share. Yet again, we could also situate and see that poverty directly relates to the ability of users, that is to generate the necessary resources and capacity to protect and regulate the common pooled resources. So therefore one can also takes into concern about the politics of gender and indigeneity, which has been especially prominent in this regard, that is in the consumption of contributions of scholars of forests of commons. Now one can again look at the kind of ideas which is being posited by works of this. Now one can actually see the kind of institutional arrangement, that is the idea, that is the conventional the wisdom of on nature and effective local institutions, which has also been confirmed by the contributions of researchers on the forest commons. Now there are ideas which is or principle which is being put forward, which talks about rules should be locally created and enforced. So therefore the import of the insight lies in the recognition that local users and their organizers have comparative, if not absolute advantage when it comes to knowing about the resources, whereas other users I mean in compared to other users and environmental conditions. And again the local users are again best equipped to use this knowledge, that is to create institutional arrangement more suited to the governing forest effectively. Yet again at this point there is also a contention what local means in this context is pretty much contested, because local can be defined in terms of birth, residency, contiguity and of location, and degree of dependence on the resource, and contribution to the creation of local institutions and so forth. So one of the important points which we can sort of derive from this is that the effects of different ways of thinking about forest use, conservation and management among the subject to governance are pretty much likely to central to the possibility of effective governance. So one can see the way in which how the local users or the locals can be very much actively engaged in the governance, or in other words the institutional arrangement. So before coming to this, we can further add few points relating to what the nature of external environment, that is deforestation was versus conditions of forest commons. And one can also see how the state may always have been central in determining the changing areas of forest which are available to communities as the ultimate guarantors of property rights arrangement. But in the past few decades there is an increasing a number of governments which have again decentralized control over diverse natural resource to local user groups, and a substantial literature on indigenous peoples and forest, and the importance of markets and market institutions on local and extra local forest related outcomes and interactions between biophysical and social institutional variables where forest related outcomes are concerned. So therefore, one can see the relationship between institutions of governance and identities of actors. And in this common property theory, one can sort of agree and then conclude in some way by saying that the poor household rely on commons, especially the forest commons, for significant aspects of their livelihood. Now let's come to the end part of our discussions, that is the common property versus the private property. Now different ideas are being posited by different scholars, and then we have delved on that. Now one of the main problems now again is the decline in common pooled resources, because there is an assertion of control by the state, that is first on the forest resources and then over land, which has actually lead to a wide reductions of access and rights to usage of these resources. Now in some sense people were merely left with the usufruct rights. So therefore one could actually see that there is an increasing privatizations or encroachments on these common pooled resources, or what we understood as the open access regime. So therefore there is these practices or inching towards privatizations and encroachments, as well as the government appropriation, which have been ultimately the main cause or the main processes which is taking resources out of the common use. And therefore on the other hand we have these traditional methods of access control and the usufruct allocations and conflict resolutions have widely become ineffective or have actually disappeared, and as a process of which there is which is being undermined by the political, economic and social changes within the locality, village and nation. So some of the arguments which are being carried forward, that why the common property resources are likely to decline or be degraded, is because of some of the following conditions which are being outlined here. So first is the absence of individual ownership and management, which results in unprized access and hence overused. And secondly, each individual gains by increasing his or her use of labor, while the cost of that increase are borne by the group as a whole. That is tragedy of commons, which is posited by Herdent. So individuals also lack the assurance as to the outcome for themselves of competing within the management system that would benefit. That is the prisoner's dilemma argument, which is posited by Arnold. However, these arguments in some sense fail to take into account the factors which encourage collective actions, or maybe community access to resources, or community or open access regimes. So even under situations of increasing stress on the common resource and its users and the self regulating capabilities of groups of users. And then they also happens to overlook reasons why the alternative to communal management of privatizations or state controlled may not necessarily be sustainable. So one of the long standing trend towards expropriating or privatizing the common property resources has been increasingly being challenged on the grounds that these alternatives are not necessarily more efficient or appropriate. So these are some of the references which you might like to refer to, and as I have indicated, what we have discussed and outlined in the lectures so far is that begin with the natural resource management, and then today an introductory of the how resources are being managed, and in this lecture we have delved on trying to situate the existing scholarship on the commons, and then tries to look into the debates of what are the nuances which involve in how the state positing towards the appropriating of natures from the use of the commons, and also how different theories are being developed by people who are engaged in the scholarship or the works on forest based commons or commons in general. So in the upcoming classes we will be trying to look at some of the conflicts which arises in terms of access to resources, conservations, by trying to historically situate some of the laws and rules which are policies which are being framed by the state, and then how it goes against the interests of those peoples concerned who are actually living closely, or maybe in terms of access to resources for their means of livelihoods, and so on and so forth. Thank you.